He built an empire of glass and steel and shattered lives with the same precision. Behind his cold gaze and flawless suit lay the memory of a rope on a beam, a home lost to debt, and his father's final broken stare. Now, decades later, Victor Novak had become a man whose name was whispered even in Arizona's most opulent halls. He didn't yell. He didn't take revenge in rage. He executed his strikes like an architect designs skyscrapers, precisely, silently, irreversibly. One message, one photo, one wrong move, and you were erased not only from his life but from your own. But what happens when the most calculated man meets something beyond control? A new life born from the ashes of his vengeance. A child's hand asking for nothing but a chance. Sometimes revenge doesn't end with a gunshot. It ends with a question. What if you didn't really win? Greetings, my dear friend. I am very happy that you are watching my video, and I will be even happier if you subscribe to my channel. This will make me even happier. Let's get started. Victor Novak hadn't become the undisputed titan of Arizona real estate by offering second chances. At 48, he wore elegance like a mask, sleek suits, and cultivated charm concealing a mind sharpened by relentless ambition. Over the last decade, his firm, Meridian Properties, had transformed from a boutique firm into the undisputed architect of Phoenix's vertical evolution. Golden sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, casting elongated silhouettes over a scale model of his newest vision, a luxury development set to redefine the city's skyline. $3 billion, the largest private investment in state history. A rare smile played at the corners of Victor's mouth. Line 2. It's your wife, his assistant informed him through the intercom, her tone efficient and impersonal. Without turning from the model, Victor lifted the receiver to his ear. Lena, I'm in the middle of something, he said coolly. Remember the Harrison Gala tonight. Her voice responded with practiced poise, though lately he'd begun to notice a crack beneath the surface, a subtle fracture behind the melodic tone. I haven't forgotten. He stepped toward the window, fingers interlaced behind his back. Did you confirm with the Kellers? They'll meet us there, she replied, then paused. Damien may be a bit late. He's finalizing the Westlake transaction. At the mention of Damien Foster, Victor's jaw flexed. For 7 years, Damien had been both ally and asset, bringing international capital and high-stakes connections when Victor needed them most. He was daring, strategic, and utterly ruthless, the kind of man Victor admired, in theory. Tell him punctuality matters. The senator won't be kept waiting. I'm not your secretary, Victor, Lena said, her voice sharpened by an unfamiliar edge. He stood silent for a beat, watching his own reflection blur in the glass. When had her voice grown cold? When had admiration in her eyes faded to indifference? 15 years of marriage had drifted from passion to ritual, and now teetered into something colder, something transactional. I'll see you tonight, he said at last, cutting the line before she could reply. That evening, Victor entered their Paradise Valley home, a fortress of glass, steel, and precision that whispered wealth and control. The house was still, save for the distant murmur of running water upstairs. In the master bedroom, he spotted Lena's phone on the unmade bed. He wasn't the prying type, not because of trust, but because he engineered his life with such accuracy that paranoia seemed unnecessary. Still, the message lighting the screen gave him pause. A text. From Damien. Can't wait to feel you again. Make up a reason. Come over after. Victor stood motionless, the device resting in his palm, the weight of the words anchoring him. The betrayal didn't surprise him. In his world, allegiance was a commodity. What caught him off guard was the sting beneath the surface, a flicker of pain, quickly replaced by a cold, exacting fury. He returned the phone to its place, untouched, and walked to his study, pouring himself a measured bourbon. He didn't lash out. That wasn't his nature. He drank slowly, methodically. Already, the architecture of revenge was forming in his mind, precise, invisible, and inevitable. 3 months slipped by. Victor waited. No accusations, no confrontation. He watched in silence, an observer cloaked in control. Tuesdays, Thursday nights under the guise of work calls, Sunday mornings at the golf course. Their affair had a routine, one so predictable it disgusted him more than the act itself. In his private study, Victor reviewed the files delivered by the discreet investigator he'd hired. Photographic evidence of Lena entering Damien's upscale condo. Screenshots of intimate texts, phone logs, hotel receipts. Undeniable proof. Blake Harrington, his attorney of nearly 2 decades, and the closest thing Victor had to a friend, stepped into the room. "You said it was urgent." Victor motioned to the chair across from his desk. "I want to reorganize Meridian's ownership structure." Blake, a legal tactician who'd helped craft Victor's empire from the ground up, studied him closely. "What aren't you saying?" "Damien's been sleeping with Lena." Blake didn't flinch. In their world, such betrayals were rarely shocking. "You've got confirmation?" Victor slid the dossier across the desk. "More than enough." As Blake leafed through the contents, his expression darkened. "What's the plan?" "I want everything," Victor said, voice steady. "His shares, his holdings, his name." "The partnership agreement protects him. So does your prenup." Victor's smile was cold and calculated. "Contracts are just stories, Blake, and stories can be rewritten." For the next 2 hours, they designed a campaign worthy of a boardroom coup, precise, ruthless, and entirely above suspicion. None of it would be kind. Victor had constructed his real estate empire behind a facade of complex legal entities, an intricate labyrinth of holding companies, offshore accounts, and silent stakeholders that obscured his true reach. Today, those same obfuscations would become his instruments of vengeance. He gestured toward the Westlake project, the crown jewel Damien had spearheaded. "I want majority control moved under High Point Holdings," he instructed in an even tone. Across the table, Blake narrowed his eyes, confusion flickering. "Damien's clueless about your ties to High Point," he pointed out. "Exactly," Victor replied, his voice unbothered. "We'll reframe it as a partnership deal. Once it closes next month, Clause 2 activates. High Point assumes total control. He probably skimmed past that provision entirely. And about his residence?" "You're targeting his house now?" "It's financed through Meridian," Victor said flatly. "I'm recalling the loan." Blake removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose with frustration. "This is nuclear, Victor. Why not just leave Lena and buy Damien out of the firm?" Victor leaned forward, voice soft but resolute. "I don't bargain with thieves. I erase them." What he withheld was the true origin of his rage, a scar far older than any marriage or business loss. As a boy, he'd witnessed his father, a humble builder, lose everything when a trusted associate emptied their accounts and vanished without a trace. The collapse had devastated them. Foreclosure came next. His father's suicide was the final blow. From that wreckage rose Victor's obsession with dominance and a merciless response to betrayal. After Blake departed, Victor opened a drawer and took out a small velvet box. Inside gleamed a pair of diamond earrings, Lena's intended birthday gift. Without hesitation, he snapped it shut and tossed it into the trash. That evening, at dinner, he observed Lena idly nudging asparagus across her plate. Her hair fell forward, concealing half her face. Once he would have brushed it back, offered a soft smile. Now, he watched a stranger inhabiting his wife's features. "Westlake's set to close next month," he said casually. "Damien's confident it'll yield double returns in 2 years." Lena glanced up, fork pausing midair. That's wonderful. He's practically been living at the site. I admire his dedication. A flicker, something like guilt, flashed across her expression before she masked it behind a tight smile. He's always been determined, she added. Determined, Victor echoed, swirling his wine glass. Yes, Damien's never struggled to claim what he wants. Later, while reviewing contracts in his study, his phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen from an unknown number. Delivery complete, surveillance in place. The wiretaps had been installed throughout Damien's luxury apartment. Victor now had a direct line to their hidden treacheries. Marissa Pierce had always seen herself as a devoted sister. 2 years Lena's junior, she had been her confidant, her partner in mischief. When Lena had broken down 6 months prior, confessing the affair, Marissa had shielded her, fabricating alibis, offering support, and lying to cover her tracks. You deserve more, she'd told her. Victor treats you like a prize, not a person. Now, seated across from Victor in an upscale Scottsdale bistro, Marissa felt a chill crawl up her spine despite the warm night. Thanks for meeting me, Victor said, his voice polite, though laced with something colder. Marissa shifted in her seat. You mentioned something about Lena's birthday? In a manner of speaking, he slid a manila envelope across the table. Have a look. Inside were surveillance photos. Marissa driving Lena to Damien's building, answering Victor's calls with false reassurances, spinning practiced lies. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the evidence. I can explain, she stammered, her face draining of color. No explanation needed, Victor replied, his smile thin and merciless. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Her position as head of marketing at one of Victor's firms had been the apex of her career. You can't just fire me, she gasped. I already have. Your credentials were revoked 20 minutes ago. Security is boxing up your office now. I only did this to protect her. From you. No, Victor said, leaning in. You're out because loyalty matters to me, and you chose your side. I'll tell her everything. I'll expose this. Please do, Victor said, barely suppressing a smirk. Tell her how you lied for her, how you're out of a job, how your career's in ruins. She'll appreciate knowing I've already made my move. Marissa fled in tears. Victor remained behind, sipping his scotch slowly, savoring the fall of the first domino. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had engineered. Later that night, Lena stormed into his study, fury emanating from her every step. You fired Marissa? Because she didn't kiss your ring at the gala? Victor didn't bother looking up from his screen. Her performance has been declining for months. The board made the decision. Don't insult me, Lena snapped. You are the board. You run everything like some kind of puppet master. Only then did Victor swivel to face her. Careful, he said, his tone dangerously even. You're awfully upset over her job loss. Almost unusually upset. There was a subtle shift in his tone that made her pause. What are you getting at? Nothing worth mentioning, he said, already back to scribbling notes on a document in front of him. She lingered a second longer, the unease growing. Perhaps she should have been more careful about mixing her personal life with business. Once Lena had left, Victor activated the live feed streaming from Damien's penthouse. As expected, his business partner was pacing in frustration, phone pressed tightly to his ear. She's beginning to catch on, Damien muttered. Her sister got canned this morning. Yeah, of course I think it's connected. No, he can't possibly suspect anything. I've been careful. Every detail's been covered. Victor leaned in, enlarging the view to study Damien's face. The tension etched into his features was telling. The man who had crossed him, taken what was his, was about to discover the true weight of betrayal. But not yet. The game had only just begun. Victor was still arranging the pieces. The next morning, Victor placed a call to Howard Byrne, the seasoned CEO of First Arizona Bank and a longtime confidant. "Howard," he said smoothly, "I'm calling in that favor." By lunch, Damien's credit lines were frozen under the pretense of a standard regulatory audit. By evening, whispers began to spread in tightly knit circles of influential investors, rumors that Meridian was facing a cash crunch. The kind of rumor that doesn't need to be true to be dangerous. Victor moved with precision, orchestrating setbacks that seemed coincidental. Damien's assistant abruptly quit. Zoning clearance for his Scottsdale resort was mysteriously stalled. Isolated events, seemingly minor. But collectively, they applied pressure, tightening slowly, deliberately. Meanwhile, Victor took up the role of devoted husband once more, sending flowers, booking last-minute dinners, performing the rituals of a man trying to mend fences. Lena's discomfort was becoming harder to mask. Confusion began to flicker in her eyes more often, and soon, confusion would give way to dread. The Meridian Properties annual gala, Phoenix's premier event for power and prestige, buzzed with opulence. Top-tier executives, financiers, and developers mingled beneath chandeliers, glasses raised to toast another successful year. In the center of it all stood Victor, composed and polished in a tailored tuxedo, a glass of champagne in hand. "To future triumphs," he announced with suave conviction, "and to fearless new beginnings." His gaze swept across the glittering room until it landed on Lena, stunning in a green dress that shimmered beneath the lights. Damien stood at her side, confident and smiling like a man who thought the war was already won. They didn't realize the unraveling had already begun. Victor navigated the room with ease, exchanging pleasantries and empty promises, until at last he reached the pair. His greeting to Damien was flawless. "There he is," Damien said warmly, clapping Victor's shoulder. "The mastermind behind Westlake. This deal will take us national." "Actually," Victor replied, his voice dipping into something more conspiratorial, "we might need to re-examine a few structural details. My attorneys flagged some concerns about the tax implications." Damien blinked, caught off guard, his grin faltering for a beat. "Re-examine? We're supposed to close next week." "Nothing major," Victor said lightly. "We'll sort it out Monday." Before Damien could respond, Victor turned to Lena, lifted her hand, and brushed her knuckles with a kiss. "You look absolutely stunning," he murmured. The confusion that danced across her face was perfect. For weeks he'd kept her off balance, one moment distant, the next attentive, always shifting, never still. "Dance with me?" he said. Not a question, already guiding her toward the floor. They moved in rhythm to the slow melody, bodies close but miles apart. The space between them was filled with silence, secrets, and carefully measured lies. "I can smell his cologne on you," Victor whispered. She stiffened instantly. "What are you saying?" "Damien's cologne, sandalwood, a touch of citrus. Hard to miss." Her face lost all color. "Victor, not here," he cut in softly, keeping his expression serene for the crowd. "Not now, but soon. We'll have that conversation." They finished the dance in loaded silence. Her posture was rigid, her movements mechanical. When the music faded, Victor led her back to their table where Damien waited, his expression already laced with suspicion. "Everything okay?" he asked, noting Lena's pale complexion. "Couldn't be better," Victor replied smoothly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I was just reminding my wife how much I value loyalty." The following morning, Victor convened an emergency meeting of Meridian's board. By then, the rumors he had planted had taken root. Anxious and primed, the directors voted unanimously to restructure the Westlake project. Damien was removed from leadership and control transferred to High Point Holdings, a firm intricately tied to Victor's own network. That afternoon, Damien burst into Victor's office, furious and visibly shaken. "What the hell are you playing at?" he bellowed, slamming the door behind him. "You cut me out, went to the board, sabotaged the deal, froze my accounts. Are you out of your mind?" Victor looked up calmly, unbothered from behind his desk. "Market's unpredictable, Damien. Surely you understand." "This isn't about the market," Damien snapped. "This is personal. What did I ever do to deserve this?" Victor stood with calculated calm and walked to the bar cart. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey with steady hands. He still hadn't answered. "What did you do?" A strange question, especially from the man who's been sleeping with my wife for 7 months and counting. Damien's complexion drained, the color vanishing from his face like light fading from a room. "Victor, just let me explain." Victor cut in, voice steady, eyes gleaming with something colder than anger. He handed Damien a crystal tumbler, his smile thin and razor-edged. "No need. Actually, I owe you a small debt of gratitude. You helped me identify a weak link I should have spotted sooner. I'm addressing it now." Damien didn't touch the drink. His hand trembled as he set it down on the glass table. "This is how you deal with it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level. "Come on, we're not amateurs. I'll walk away from Lena. I'll dump the shares. Take a loss if I have to." Victor turned his back on him and moved toward the massive desk that anchored the room. He looked like a man fully in control of his terrain. "Very noble of you," he said, pressing a button built discreetly into the desk's surface. But not enough. The door opened. 2 men in tailored suits appeared, silent and unreadable. "You'll be escorted out," Victor continued. "Your credentials have been revoked. Anything you left here will be delivered to your apartment." Damien's face darkened with resistance. "You can't just erase me. I still hold 20% of Meridian." Victor opened a folder and flipped through the contents with clinical precision. "Correction. You did. As of this morning, those shares were sold off to satisfy your outstanding debts with High Point Holdings. The clause in the Westlake acquisition agreement, you should have read it more carefully." The realization hit Damien hard. The guards inched closer. "This isn't the end," he growled. Victor smiled without warmth. "Oh, I think it is." And Damien, he let the silence do its work. "You might want to start packing. Your penthouse goes into foreclosure tomorrow at noon." Victor arrived home earlier than usual that evening. Upstairs, he found Lena in the master bedroom, hurriedly throwing clothes into a suitcase. Her mascara had run, her expression tangled in fear and defiance. "Going somewhere?" he asked, leaning in the doorway like a man watching a play unfold. She spun around, startled. Her voice cracked with tension. "I'm leaving." "Because I cut Damien loose? Or because your sister lost her job for helping you cover it all up?" She froze mid-fold, blouse still in her hands. "How long have you known?" she asked. Victor walked in slowly, the weight of judgment thick in the air. "Long enough to make sure none of you walk away clean." His tone didn't rise. He didn't flinch. "Damien's finished. No company, no roof, no reputation. He's nothing." Tears welled up in her eyes again. "You're heartless." "No," Victor replied, voice flat and deliberate. "I'm just balancing the scales." The Novak estate no longer felt like a home. It felt like a gilded cage. For 3 days, Lena drifted from room to room, disoriented and restless, the walls closing in a little more each hour. Every exit, figurative and literal, had been shut quietly but completely. Damien stopped answering her calls. Marissa had disappeared, whispered to have left town entirely. Lena's access to funds, still linked to Victor's accounts, had been reduced to the bare minimum. Victor, meanwhile, moved through the wreckage like a man untouched by the storm. Every morning he left in a tailored suit, calm and composed. Every night he returned like nothing had changed. He spoke to her only when necessary, always formal, always distant. He wasn't cruel, he was clinical, observing her slow collapse like it was a formality. It was nearly 1 a.m. on the fourth night when Lena stood alone in the kitchen holding a glass of wine and her phone. The screen glowed with unanswered messages, all to Damien, all ignored. She didn't hear Victor approach until he was in the doorway, barefoot, shirtless, wearing only black silk pajama pants. Calm, unreadable, still entirely in control. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, pouring himself water without waiting for a reply. She turned to face him, her voice raw. "How are you pretending like this is normal? Like we're just having a rough patch?" Victor leaned against the counter, arms folded. His eyes never left hers. "What would satisfy you? That I throw a fit, smash a lamp, beg you to stay?" She slammed the wine glass down, liquid sloshing over the rim. "I want to see something. I want proof you still feel anything." He didn't flinch. "You want honesty? Here it is. I feel disgust. I feel betrayed. And more than anything, I feel like justice finally arrived." She let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You call this justice? You destroyed lives because your pride took a hit." Victor stepped forward, his presence suddenly heavier, darker. "No," he said quietly. "This was never about pride." His voice stayed even, but the force behind it was unshakable. "This is about responsibility, about consequences. You made choices. So did Damien. So did Marissa. And now you're all living with the result." She lowered her head. Her voice cracked. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Victor shook his head slowly. "Don't insult us both. You did mean to. That's the part you still won't face. The affair, the lies, that was your rebellion. Your little escape route from a life that didn't flatter your ego." His words were like a blade. She didn't stagger, but she bent emotionally, like something inside her had buckled. At first, Damien had been a diversion, a thrill, a way to shake loose the tight structure of her marriage. But somewhere along the way, she let herself believe it was more. "He said he loved me," she whispered. For the briefest moment, something flickered in Victor's expression. Not sympathy, not pain, just recognition. "And you believed him?" he asked, the edge in his voice softened by a trace of pity too subtle to name. "Damien is an opportunist, Lena. You weren't his prize. You were his gateway. A convenient route into my world, my network. Do you really think it was a coincidence that he pursued you just as the Westlake contract was nearing completion?" The quiet unease that had been building in her for weeks suddenly crystallized into certainty. She recalled how distant Damien had grown, how even in their most intimate moments, his mind seemed elsewhere, constantly prying into Victor's schedule, his meetings, his future business intentions. "You're lying," she said, but the conviction behind her words had vanished. "Am I?" Victor unlocked his phone, tapped through a few screens, and slid it across the counter toward her. "Go ahead. Play it." The silence in the kitchen was interrupted by Damien's voice, unmistakably clear. He was speaking to someone unfamiliar. "Victor hasn't got a clue. His wife hands me everything. His movements, his business tactics, the entire strategy. Once the Westlake deal closes, we'll have enough leverage to force him out for good." The impact of those words was visceral. The betrayal she had committed paled in comparison to what Damien had orchestrated behind her back. "When did this happen?" she asked numbly. 4 weeks ago, Victor said, his tone like ice. "The man sharing your bed has been conning you as expertly as you conned me." Her hand trembled. The wine glass slipped from her grasp and shattered on the tile, splinters of glass and red liquid scattering in all directions. She dropped instinctively to the floor, fumbling to gather the shards. A sliver sliced her finger. She stared at the blood mixing with the wine. dazed. "I've been such a fool," she murmured. "Yes," Victor replied flatly. He stepped closer and knelt, avoiding the debris. "What matters now is what you're going to do about it." She looked up at him, her face crumbling. "What choices do I even have? You've already destroyed me." "Not entirely," he said softly. "Not yet." He leaned in. "If there's any part of your life worth saving, you'll tell me everything. Every lie Damien told, every detail he let slip, every accomplice. No more secrets. Then maybe we can talk about what happens next." "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze hardened into steel. "Then I keep dismantling everything around you, one asset, one ally at a time, until there's nothing left." The next day, in Victor's office, the truth spilled out. A voice recorder sat between them as Lena relived it all. For hours, she recounted the affair's beginnings, how it started while Victor was overseas, how Damien's charm and persistence chipped away at her better judgment. She described the thrill, the secrecy, the eventual surrender. Then came the mechanics, Marissa's alibis, the invented appointments, the nights she looked Victor in the eye and lied. She listed names, unraveling the web that had enabled it all. There was the concierge who ensured no questions were asked, the maitre d' who always had a private table ready, even Victor's former assistant, who adjusted schedules and cleared time so they could meet undetected. But the worst revelation was corporate. She outlined how Damien had siphoned off confidential strategies, sensitive data, Meridian's blueprints that had somehow landed in Apex Development's lap. When she finished, her shoulders slumped, her energy drained. Victor shut off the recorder without comment. "So what now?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Now," he said, "we finally have the conversation we've been avoiding." The penthouse where Damien had once entertained her with arrogance was a shadow of itself. Boxes stood like silent sentinels along the walls, the furniture swathed in dust covers. That morning, a foreclosure notice had been taped to the door, 48 hours to vacate. His phone buzzed. Lena's name lit the screen. After ignoring her for days, he finally answered. "We need to talk," she said immediately. "Victor knows everything." "I figured," Damien replied darkly. "He's been unraveling everything piece by piece. He wants to meet, both of us, tonight." He gave a bitter laugh. "Let me guess, so he can gloat while we squirm? I'll pass. He's offering a deal. Says he might return your shares, stop the foreclosure." Her voice cracked with urgency. The desperation mirrored the chaos he'd been barely containing. Bank accounts frozen, deals collapsing, reputations burned. Even a sliver of hope was something. "Fine. Where?" "His house. 8 sharp." The gates to the Novak estate opened with a low hum. The structure loomed ahead, sleek, cold, a monument to power. Damien felt a chill despite the warm desert air. Inside, the study was dimly lit. Lena sat on a leather sofa, diminished and exhausted. Victor, by contrast, was composed, almost serene. He greeted Damien like a host receiving a guest. "Scotch? You always did have a taste for Macallan 25. Damien didn't move. "Let's cut the performance. Lena said you want to make a deal. Is that true?" Victor glanced at Lena, then back at him. "That's not quite how I put it, but close enough. Sit." Damien hesitated, then sat across from Lena. Victor began, voice calm but razor sharp. "I've spent the last few days calculating the cost of your betrayal, your lies, and the sabotage." He turned toward Damien. "And yes, I'm fully aware of your conversations with Apex." Damien's reaction was swift, a flicker of alarm he couldn't suppress. "That was nothing. Just exploratory talk. Nothing concrete." Victor's smile was tight, joyless. "Let's not insult each other with half-truths. We've long passed that point. I made sure none of it ever reached its destination, Victor said with unsettling ease, gently sipping his drink. Still, your intent couldn't have been clearer. Lena's voice was almost inaudible, her composure cracking. What is it that you want from us? I want back everything the two of you stripped from me, Victor replied, placing his glass down with meticulous control. Respect, loyalty, power. He let the silence amplify his words before continuing. Of course, those things don't come with price tags, so I'll settle for watching you both lose everything you fought to steal from me. Damien's voice was jagged with resentment. I've already lost it all. My shares, my home, my name. Not quite, Victor said coldly. You're not there yet. He reached for a remote and pressed a button. A large screen on the wall flickered to life. Footage appeared, crystal clear, showing Damien and Lena entangled in an intimate moment inside Victor's own penthouse. Lena's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God! There's a vault full, Victor said as though commenting on the weather. Hours upon hours, every touch, every whisper, and some rather telling conversations about me. My company, my blind spots. Damien lunged forward, fists balled. You twisted bastard! Sit, Victor snapped, the words slicing through the air. Damien froze, then obeyed without thinking. Here's how this is going to unfold, Victor said, his voice shifting to clinical. Lena's already confessed. She didn't hold back. Now it's your turn. And if I refuse, Damien growled, then every minute of footage, along with documentation of your attempted sabotage, will be sent to every investor, every executive, every connection you haven't yet lost. And let me remind you, corporate espionage carries serious prison time. Damien's face was a battlefield of rage and dread. What exactly do you want from me? Everything, Victor said flatly. Every name, every tactic, every lie you told. For the next 60 minutes, Victor extracted a full confession, guiding Damien with precision. Every question felt less like curiosity and more like confirmation. When it ended, Damien was slumped, crushed beneath the weight of his own downfall. Victor leaned back slightly, his tone final. And now, the moment you've both been avoiding. Victor. Lena's voice wavered. Yes. I've been involved with your partner for months. And I told you, confession must feel like a release, Victor replied, almost theatrically calm. You wondered why I wasn't livid. A cold smile tugged at his lips. Because your lover never realized he was handing his kingdom over to me piece by piece. The company, mine, the estate, reclaimed. And your sister, the one who helped you bury the evidence, terminated. Silence collapsed over the room like a trap door. Damien looked nauseous. Lena seemed to fold inward. That's it? Damien croaked. You brought us here to humiliate us? No, Victor said, rising to his feet. I brought you here to witness the prologue. He paused deliberately. Tomorrow, a curated group of recipients gets the recordings. By the end of the week, everyone in our orbit will know the truth and exactly who orchestrated the betrayal. You'll drag yourself down with us, Damien warned. A scandal like this, it'll stain Meridian too. Victor's grin was unfazed. I've already calculated the impact. Some wounds require surgery. As security escorted Damien out, Victor turned his icy focus to Lena. As for you, collect your belongings. The divorce papers will be delivered by morning. Victor, please. The only reason you're walking away with anything at all is because even my lawyers couldn't completely circumvent Arizona's community property laws. He stepped in close, voice sharpened to a blade. And the settlement? It will mirror the worth you brought into this marriage. Left alone in the stillness of his private study, Victor poured himself another drink. On the monitor, Damien was shown being escorted off the premises. Phase 1 was complete. The betrayal exposed, the traitors dismantled. but his retribution was only just beginning. 3 months later, Phoenix's elite circles still whispered about the fallout from the Novak Foster implosion. Damien's confession had been released with surgical timing, devastating yet measured, allowing Meridian to distance itself with carefully worded statements about internal misconduct and a fresh corporate vision. Damien vanished from the Arizona spotlight entirely. Whispers suggested he had resurfaced in Albuquerque, working low-level real estate, living in a leased condo, and driving a rented sedan, a ghost of the man who once mingled in marble boardrooms. Lena had fared only slightly better. She now lived in a modest condominium sustained by the thinnest slice of the divorce payout, just enough to survive, thanks to the bare minimum Victor's legal team couldn't withhold. Her sister Marissa returned to Phoenix only to find doors closed at every turn. Victor's influence had seen to that. Neither woman would find a foothold in the industry again. As for Victor, he emerged not just untarnished, but even more formidable. His calm, calculated handling of the betrayal left Phoenix's power players wary, but deeply respectful. The man who had been betrayed came back colder, sharper, and more dangerous than ever before. Now, the world finally saw him for who he truly was. No one crossed Victor Novak and came away clean. That was a rule carved in stone. On a crisp October morning, he was seated at his preferred breakfast spot, meticulously reviewing the architectural plans for a new high-rise project, when a sudden shadow cut across the papers on his table. "Is this seat taken?" came a voice he couldn't mistake, familiar enough to make his head lift without hesitation. Standing before him was Paula Bishop, Lena's mother, composed in a sharply tailored navy pantsuit that masked her 65 years with elegance. "Paula," Victor acknowledged, gesturing calmly to the seat opposite him. "Didn't think I'd run into you today." She sat down with fluid grace, flagging the server for coffee. Once her order was placed, her piercing blue eyes, so reminiscent of her daughter's, locked onto his with unnerving steadiness. "I figured it was time we had a conversation," she said coolly, "about what's left of my daughters." She stirred cream into her coffee with slow precision, then looked back at him. "They're both shadows now, empty versions of who they were, and that, Victor, is your handiwork." His smile was all edges. "They made their choices, Paula, adult choices, and adults live with consequences." "You engineered their collapse," she replied, her voice glacial as she took a measured sip. "Marissa can't even get a call back in this city. Lena's terrified of her own reflection. Was it really necessary to destroy them to this extent?" "I thought it was," he answered without a hint of apology. She blinked, caught off guard by the cold certainty of his words. "In my world," he went on, "betrayal demands resolution, complete resolution." Paula's eyes narrowed as she studied him. "I warned Lena the day she brought you home, told her men who bury their emotions don't stay calm forever. When they finally break, the damage is catastrophic." "You were right," Victor said, his voice steady. "She ignored me," Paula murmured. "She saw the charm, the ambition, the man who swept her away, not the wounded child hiding behind the tailored suit." His jaw flexed. "If this is going to be a therapy session, we're done here." "I didn't come to analyze you," she said, leaning forward. "I came to ask you to stop. You've already won. They're broken. What more do you need? Lena still gets monthly support. Marissa still has real estate in her name. Damien's still alive. So no, I'm not done." For the first time, Paula's poise cracked. "What more could you possibly want?" "Balance," he said simply. "Justice isn't a fixed point, Paula. It's a scale, and mine hasn't evened out yet." "This isn't justice," she whispered. "It's vengeance." "That difference only matters to the powerless," Victor replied as he neatly gathered his documents, a clear signal that their conversation was over. "Tell them both I still think about them." The chill in his voice drained the color from her face. Victor rose, placed a crisp bill on the table to cover both coffees, and walked out with deliberate calm. The message had been delivered. The bishop heard it loud and clear. So had his father, though far too late to save himself. In Victor's world, strength ruled and weakness got trampled, and he'd long ago decided which side he belonged to. Back at the sleek, glass-paneled headquarters of Meridian, he scanned the latest internal update on Damien Foster's downward spiral. His former partner had just been terminated from a minor position in Albuquerque, ousted quietly after vague ethical issues were brought to light. Victor's assistant, Trevor Walsh, methodical, unemotional, and hand-picked for those very qualities, stepped into the room with the day's schedule. Apex Development confirmed for 3 hours, Trevor said. Their CEO insisted on speaking with you directly. A flicker of satisfaction played across Victor's expression. Apex, the same company Damien had once conspired with, was now hemorrhaging projects to Meridian. Their desperation was beginning to reek. Perfect, Victor said. And the other matter? Handled this morning, Trevor confirmed. Miss Pierce's mortgage application was declined by all 4 lenders. Her lease ends in a month. Marissa's latest attempt at independence, buying a modest home in Tucson, far from Victor's influence, had been quietly sabotaged at every turn. Some would call it overkill. Victor called it precision. Betrayal, in his view, demanded consequences that were thorough and enduring. His influence stretched far, his memory farther. Late that evening, as the skyline of Phoenix shimmered beyond his office window, his private line rang. Only a handful of people had the number. "Novak," he answered. "It's Blake," came the voice of his attorney, tight with tension. "There's something you should know. Damien Foster took his own life earlier today." Victor froze, his hand poised mid-note, though his voice remained composed. "How?" "Gunshot. At his apartment. He left a note. Mentioned you by name." "This might turn messy," Blake added, his tone cautious. "Handle it," Victor said, quietly, thoroughly. Once the call ended, Victor crossed to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the city skyline, a kingdom he had built with ruthless intent, one decision at a time. Damien's demise was supposed to be the final thunderous chord in Victor Novak's long-composed symphony of vengeance, a finale he'd envisioned with ruthless clarity. Instead, all that remained was an unanticipated emptiness, not guilt. That emotion had long been exiled from his psyche. It was the bitter ache of an ending stolen. Damien had robbed him of the satisfaction of complete annihilation by seizing control of his own exit. For the first and only time, Victor had to admit it. Damien had slipped beyond his reach. Running into Lena again hadn't factored into any of Victor's plans. Their divorce had been executed with the precision of a scalpel. He'd claimed the lion's share of their joint fortune and ensured her quiet disappearance from the social sphere of Phoenix's elite. Their lives had diverged entirely, and yet she now stood in the opulent lobby of Meridian Properties, all glass, steel, and stone, noticeably thinner than he remembered. Her once effervescent hair now pulled into a tight, joyless ponytail that only magnified the strain in her expression. She was no longer Mrs. Novak. She was simply Lena Bishop again. "Miss Bishop," Trevor greeted her coolly, emphasizing the name with deliberate formality, a small humiliation Victor had instructed all staff to enforce. "You're not on the schedule." "I only need 5 minutes," she said quietly, her eyes locking onto Victor's as he emerged from the elevator. "Please." He thought about walking straight past her. She held no real weight anymore. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe something darker, made him hesitate. 5 minutes, he said flatly, motioning toward a small, private conference room off to the side. As the door shut behind them, the composure she wore began to crumble. Her voice was ragged with emotion. "Damien is dead because of you." "No," Victor answered evenly, choosing to stand while she sank into a chair. Damien is dead because of himself. That was his decision. You drove him to the edge. You blacklisted him, isolated him, left him nothing. I handed him the outcome of his choices, Victor interjected. Nothing more, nothing less. She stared up at him with hollow eyes, as if recognizing, perhaps for the first time, the full extent of the transformation inside him. What happened to you? Who turned you into this? Reality, he said with ice in his tone. Life did. You have 3 minutes left. Lena inhaled deeply, pulling herself together. I'm pregnant. The words echoed in the room like a dropped stone hitting deep water, small but with expanding ripples. Victor said nothing. Her hand drifted instinctively to her stomach, though she still bore no visible change. It's Damien's. He did the calculations instantly, the timeline, the context, the ramifications. And why bring this to me? Because I have nowhere else to go, she said, voice quivering. Everything's gone. My reputation is in shambles. My accounts are frozen. My family's barely surviving. I can't do this alone. You came for money? His tone was flint. I came for something that looks like peace, she answered quietly. For myself. For the baby. For whatever's left of the future. What will it take for you to let go of this war, Victor? He studied her, this worn, hollowed-out version of the woman he once believed he'd loved. Her news introduced a new, disquieting element, a child conceived in the shadows of Damien's fall, yet untouched by the sins of those involved. It changes nothing, he said at last. The pain you're in is the consequence of your own betrayal. Don't try to make it mine. Then explain why you're still targeting Marissa. Why you ensured my mother's loan was denied. Why you sabotaged Damien's last harmless job. Because betrayal must be punished, he said, voice like a blade. Because anyone who comes at me, anyone, must be a lesson. I leave no threat standing. He glanced at his watch. You have 1 minute. Lena rose to her feet. Despite the desperation swimming in her eyes, there was something unbroken in her posture. Then I'll spend it saying this. I'm keeping this child, and one day, when they're old enough to understand, I'll tell them the truth about their father, about the man who destroyed him. I'll make sure they know who Victor Novak really is. The man who built an empire but declared war on anyone who dared to betray him. Be careful with your words, Lena. That wasn't a threat, she said, holding his gaze. It was a promise. You can dictate everything else, but not what I teach Damien's child about you. She left without another word. The soft click of the door sounded final, like a judge's gavel. Victor remained motionless, rooted in the silence she'd left behind, the weight of her revelation settling like dust on the floor. A child. A continuation of Damien's bloodline, surviving the meticulously crafted ruin Victor had designed. The thought gnawed at something deep inside him. Later that evening, compelled by instincts he didn't care to analyze, he found himself at a cemetery. It was a place he rarely visited. Graves never brought him comfort. But today, it felt necessary. He stood before a plain, weather-worn headstone, the resting place of his father, the man he had discovered hanging lifeless in their garage so many years ago, a man undone by betrayal, stripped of everything by a business partner's deceit. He remembered the notice of eviction taped to the door, the hollow ache of an empty refrigerator, the paralyzing silence of defeat. And he remembered the vow he'd whispered to himself at 16, a vow carved into the marrow of his being, that he would never be vulnerable again, that he would rise untouchable, that betrayal, if ever repeated, would be met with devastation. I kept that vow, he murmured to the grave. No one crosses me and walks away untouched. The desert air twisted around Victor like a phantom whisper, and in its stillness came a revelation he could no longer avoid. Every calculated blow he'd struck in his quest for vengeance, no matter how meticulously planned, no matter how crushing, had failed to fill the aching void that betrayal had hollowed out inside him. There was no restitution, no reclaiming what had been lost, only debris, silence, and a growing emptiness that thundered louder with time. But this clarity didn't soften his resolve. Viktor Novak wasn't softened by insight, but it gave him precision. Lena's pregnancy introduced a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years, a life beyond this corrosive cycle of retaliation, a future he had written off long ago. Once, he'd seen children as vulnerabilities, leverage waiting to be used against him, and he'd come to peace with being childless. That evening, as he gazed over the city skyline from his penthouse, he made a call. "I want a trust established," he told his attorney. "Anonymous funding. It's for Lena Bishop's unborn child." There was a pause on the line. Blake's voice was wary. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Victor's tone was flat. "The child isn't my enemy. Just handle it." It wasn't absolution. Forgiveness was not a currency Victor ever traded in. This act was something else. His acknowledgement that vengeance, even at its most satisfying, must have an end point. 1 year after Damian Foster's suicide, Victor stood stronger than ever. Meridian Properties had expanded into 3 new states. The once scrutinized Westlake development had more than doubled in value, boosting both Victor's fortune and his legend. The scandal that had threatened to obliterate him had instead reinforced his dominance. Within elite circles, his name carried the weight of myth, a mark of excellence wrapped in menace. Betray Viktor Novak, and you would be erased. His ruthlessness became a fortress, repelling rivals and cementing loyalty within his ranks. Everyone knew what happened to those who betrayed him. That morning, he sifted through fresh surveillance images delivered by his investigator. There she was, Lena. 7 months post-delivery, pushing a stroller through a tree-lined park in Portland. Her mother walked alongside her, apparently having relocated to help raise the baby. Marissa now worked at a small marketing firm far removed from Victor's empire. The implication was unmistakable. The Bishop women had absorbed the unspoken warning: steer clear of Viktor Novak's world if you want to preserve what's left of yours. The trust, set up quietly for Damian's child, Alexander, according to intel, would cover all necessary expenses from schooling to day-to-day needs. Victor's name wouldn't appear anywhere. This wasn't empathy. It was Victor's way of closing the chapter on his vendetta, an intentional decision to end the legacy of retaliation with him. A gentle knock broke through his thoughts. Trevor entered, his usual confidence replaced by unease. "Mr. Novak? There's a Detective Morales here. Says it's about Harrison Abernathy." Victor's expression shifted slightly. Abernathy, the concierge who had facilitated Lena and Damian's secret rendezvous, one of many whose lives Victor had unraveled with careful intent. "Send him in." Detective Gabriel Morales walked in with a quiet confidence, immune to the trappings of wealth or intimidation. "Mr. Novak, I appreciate you seeing me on short notice." Victor's voice was cool. "What's this about, Detective?" "Harrison Abernathy was found dead last night. Appears to be a suicide," Morales said. "We're still investigating all possibilities." Victor's face revealed nothing. "That's regrettable. I don't see how it concerns me." The detective didn't blink. He left a note, detailed. Morales met Victor's gaze evenly. "He named you, claimed you orchestrated his downfall, much like Damian Foster did in his final letter." Victor's tone remained steady. "People under pressure often seek someone to blame. I haven't interacted with Abernathy in over a year." But Morales pressed on. "He was fired from the Westmont Hotel the day your divorce was finalized. Not one hotel in the state would hire him after that. Then his apartment building was purchased by a subsidiary of High Point Holdings, which leads back to you." "Coincidence? Business moves with peripheral effects," Victor said. Nothing more. A faint smirk flickered on Morales's lips. Mr. Novak, I spent the morning cross-referencing individuals tied to your ex-wife and your former business partner. The pattern I found, it's far too precise to ignore. Lives dismantled with exacting precision. Victor didn't blink. Random chance. Morales leaned in just slightly. Then I'll be examining these random chances very closely, Mr. Novak. Very closely. With that, he rose and left without waiting for a response. Victor didn't move. He remained seated, turning this new variable over in his mind. Morales was unlike the others, untouched by money or influence, impossible to intimidate or control. A man determined to unravel the tightly sealed history Victor had built his empire upon. That evening, alone in his study, Victor opened a wooden box tucked away on a high shelf, one of the few surviving tokens from his youth. Inside, neatly preserved, were yellowed newspaper clippings about his father's suicide, court files from the family's bankruptcy, and one faded photograph. Richard Harmon, his father's one-time partner, the man who had taken everything from them and disappeared. 15 years ago, Victor had tracked him down, living under a different name in Florida, untouched and seemingly content. He had considered every form of retaliation, but in the end, he had chosen something else, something far more calculated. Operating from behind a shell company, Victor had quietly taken control of Richard Harmon's mortgage. He hadn't made a single move, just let it sit dormant, invisible. Meanwhile, Harmon continued living comfortably, blissfully ignorant that the house he slept in was now legally owned by the very son of the man he'd destroyed. Victor had held that move in reserve, saving it for the moment when retaliation would feel most gratifying. His ace meant to deliver the final, most personal blow. He'd envisioned the confrontation often, the second Harmon realized who he was, the flicker of horror in his eyes, followed by the unraveling of his entire life. But with Detective Morales closing in, that carefully laid scheme might need to serve a different purpose. At sunrise, Victor called Blake and gave him updated instructions. By evening, the illusion of security that defined Richard Harmon's retirement came apart at the seams. First came the foreclosure notice. Then the IRS audits hit. Shortly after, his accounts were locked without notice. Within 2 days, word got back to Victor. Harmon had collapsed at his bank during a frenzied argument, dead from a heart attack, the stress of financial ruin proving fatal. A week later, when Morales appeared at Victor's office, Victor was already waiting. "I've been reviewing your past, Mr. Novak," Morales said, skipping any pretense. "Your father's suicide in particular? Swindled by a business associate, wasn't he?" "That was decades ago," Victor replied with deliberate calm. "Not distant enough. Richard Harmon died last week, and let's just say the context feels familiar." Victor responded by pushing a sealed manila envelope across the table. This might offer some clarity. Inside, Morales found meticulously fabricated evidence, files showing Victor had only recently tracked down Harmon, claiming it had taken years, travel logs proving he was in Phoenix when the legal proceedings began, signed affidavits from Florida locals attesting to Harmon's chronic heart troubles, each page forged with flawless precision. Morales flipped through the folder, his expression tightening. "You've been thorough." "I've been misunderstood," Victor said with composure. "My father's death shaped who I became. Finding Harmon wasn't about vengeance, it was about closure. His death robbed me of that chance. It was a masterful deception, an honest wound cloaked in false innocence. Victor's grief over his father was real, but his detachment from Harmon's downfall was pure invention. The emotional authenticity of his statement made it nearly impossible to challenge. Morales left with doubts, but nothing concrete to pursue. Victor had straddled the line between truth and fiction just enough to walk away clean. In the weeks after, Victor scaled back his direct campaigns against the remaining betrayers in his life, not from forgiveness, but because Morales had become a variable he couldn't predict. He never touched the trust set aside for Damien's son, an unspoken acknowledgement that even vengeance had boundaries. Lena and her kin were permitted to start anew in the quiet expanse of Oregon with one unbreakable condition. They were to stay away from Phoenix and never speak Victor's name aloud. Meanwhile, Victor pressed forward, expanding his empire with increased calculation and colder resolve. The betrayals had only hardened what he'd long believed. Trust was a vulnerability, love a liability, and power the only true constant. 5 years to the day after Damien's death, Victor stood alone in his penthouse, gazing out at the Arizona sunset. His enemies were erased, his authority unchallenged. Still, a subtle emptiness lingered. The part of his life where connection once might have lived, where reconciliation could have taken root, remained void. He didn't grieve it. He accepted it, with the detached logic of someone who had paid the full price for absolute control. He raised his glass toward the fading light, a private toast to the bitter truths that had sculpted him. The Novak Code remained brutal but honest. Betray me, and I won't merely destroy you. I'll tear down every life tethered to yours, not out of wrath, not out of sorrow, but from unshakable conviction. In the end, Victor Novak became precisely what the world had forced him to be, a man incapable of betrayal, because he never forgot and never forgave. Our story comes to an end here. Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for taking the time to watch. If you enjoyed this story, please check out other videos on this channel. See you soon, my dear friend.